Hello, gang. Tattooed Biker here with you. And tonight, I've got 4 true cryptid encounter stories that I can't wait to share with you. I've got a couple of cryptid canine encounters, a possible Bigfoot encounter, and believe it or not, a real-life tree creature. It's going to be a wild one. So grab your gear and let's ride to cryptid country. Number 1. Dear Biker, I wanted to share an experience that I had in my early teens. I was raised in a very small rural town in South Central Florida. Very small. A one-stoplight town, to be honest. We lived in a trailer and I was the middle child of 8 siblings. One evening, I was out to visit my best friend, and the roads around there were mostly dirt. We liked to play outside until it got dark. I was on my way home one evening when I heard something out in the woods. When I looked to see what was making the noise, a huge, black, wolf-like thing just stood there on 2 legs, staring back at me. I froze, and I swear I stood there for what felt like 15 minutes. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't blink. I barely breathed. This thing was absolutely massive. I had grown up barefoot in those woods with all kinds of wildlife, and, well, this was like something I'd never seen before. Once it moved, it must have snapped me out of my trance because I turned and ran as fast as my legs would carry me. It was nearly dark, and I barely had enough light to see the dirt beneath my feet, but I remember that huge black face staring at me. Now, I never mentioned this to my parents or teachers. No one. Fast forward some 25 years later, I was putting away groceries in my older brother's house, and we were chatting about different things. Somehow, the conversation went towards the supernatural, and I made an offhand comment that at least you weren't faced with a thing that stalked the woods. My brother got deadly serious, turned around, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Oh, are you talking about the big black beast that was in the woods when we were kids?" I gotta tell you, I almost fainted right there. We had experienced almost the same thing and never knew it. Talk about validation. I don't know what that thing was, but it felt powerful. I haven't seen anything like it since, but I will never forget that experience. Signed, Henry. Number 2. Hey TB. Back in the early 90s, I went with a group to Silver Springs in Oregon. One night after dinner, I went for a stroll to find a clear spot so I could see the stars. After about 20 minutes of just sitting quietly and contemplating the sky and the stars, a breeze blew through and rustled all the trees and branches around the clearing. As the wind gently shook the trees, something caught my eye in my periphery. I looked over to my right, and there it was. For just a second or two, I saw what could best be described as a walking tree. Back then, I was just beginning to appreciate books, so at the time, I haven't read anything aside from comic books or magazines. So now today, I can describe it as looking like an Ent from The Lord of the Rings, except it had more of a round head with a definite neck attached to its shoulders. Its limbs were long and thin. It could probably touch the ground if it just relaxed its arms down. There didn't seem to be any distinction or separation between the torso and the hip area. The legs looked like a pair of articulated tree trunks with no discernible feet. It had patches of moss randomly covering its torso and legs, and this thing was about 20 feet tall. And it was holding what could best be described as a long, baseball-like club in its right hand and over its shoulder. When I first turned my head to see what caught my eye while the wind rushed by, I saw it take 3 long, deliberate steps to a spot where the clearing met the trees. What sent a chill down my spine and made me freeze for what seemed a moment of forever was that it turned its head and looked right at me, where I was sitting as it took its third step and re-entered the forest. I just sat there for another 10 minutes, feeling frozen in place, going over in my head what I had just seen. Once I shook that frozen feeling, I got to my feet and went back to the cabin, where all of us were staying, just as fast as I could. I only told one person about this after it happened, but they just found it to be a nice and creepy story before everyone turned in for the night. But when I think about it, it still haunts me to this very day. Signed, Mervyn. Number 3. Dear Tattooed, this happened in 2018. My friends Greg, Brian, Sarah, and I love exploring forests and abandoned buildings. Occasionally, we even work up the courage to go to alleged haunted buildings. Greg had found a cool little area in the woods in Palmyra that was perfect for camping. He called us up and told us, and we all started gearing up to go camping for the weekend. I was in charge of bringing food, and for some sort of protection, I'd grabbed my father's machete. A few hours later, he picks up Brian, Sarah, and me up at my house, and about halfway there, we stopped into a store for tents and extra batteries. As we were leaving, Brian and I get a weird feeling, but it was a new area for me, so I just kind of brushed it off. Later on, we finally get to the campsite and we set up the tents. Greg and Brian make a fire, while Sarah and I unpack the food and put fresh batteries in the flashlights. We all ate dinner and went to bed. Well, around 2:30 a.m., Sarah wakes me up crying, saying she saw something out in the woods. This was highly unusual, because Sarah never cried in front of anyone, but she was clearly terrified. So I grabbed a flashlight and we walk out to look around. We see and hear nothing, so I tell her, "Your eyes are just messing with you. It's fine." She nods in agreement and goes back to her tent, and I head to mine. About 10 minutes later, we hear the most bone-chilling scream that anyone had ever heard. So everyone runs out of their tents. I grab the machete and we all stand back to back with our flashlights pointing out into the forest. We all look and Brian says, "Guys, I see 4 pairs of eyes." We look and sure enough, about 50 feet away we see them. That's when one of them walks out, and this thing was 7 to 9 feet tall. And we both backed up slowly, as we don't antagonize it more. This thing, which looked like a wolf, standing there on 2 legs, well, it makes the most monstrous howl you've ever heard. We quickly turned around and we ran back to the truck. We hop in and decide to drive to a hotel and come back in the morning when the sun was out to try and get our things. We get there and rent out a room and stay, waking up around 10:30 a.m., and we went back to get our stuff. When we got there, all our tents were ripped to shreds and our backpacks were spread across the campsite. We grabbed what we could salvage and vowed to never come back. Signed, Anonymous. Number 4. Hey biker, a couple of years ago I spent the summer fighting wildfires in southern Oregon. My crew was on a particularly large fire, and an unfortunate series of events had landed us on night shift. On one of those nights, we were posted up near the top of a ridge as the fire was burning slowly up towards us from a valley below. The fire was still a good 2 miles away, so there wasn't very much for us to do besides wait. We broke out into groups of 2 and spread out over a large stretch of road, then hunkered down for the night. My partner got bored of sitting around, so he decided to hike over and check in on the groups on either side of us. The next thing I remember is waking up in a start. Apparently I had dozed off and it was dead quiet, and the air was incredibly still. Some thick smoke had settled in around us, and was messing with the bright moonlight. It's kind of hard to describe, but the light was bouncing around the smoke, so it appeared to be relatively bright, but it was smoke, so you still couldn't see more than 10 to 20 feet out in front of you. Anyways, I woke up in this dead silent, still and eerie night. I immediately knew something was wrong, but I couldn't quite place it. I tried, but I couldn't get myself to relax. As I was looking around, trying to peer through the smoke at anything that could have woken me up. At around 30 seconds after waking up, I hear a stick snapping nearby. Instant sphincter clencher. I sat straight up and switched on my headlamp to try and look around. Of course, that headlamp didn't do much to illuminate anything besides the smoke. After a few minutes of frantically looking around and not seeing or hearing anything, I started to relax a bit again and switched off my headlamp and leaned back. Around this point, I was starting to think that the setting was just too perfect for my crew not to be messing with me. Besides, animals don't like smoke, so they usually aren't around fires. About to start laughing at myself for being so jumpy over nothing and yell that they weren't going to scare me this time. Just then, I heard another crack. A lot closer this time, only about 20 feet away. That's when I knew this wasn't anyone in my crew. It was far too silent that night for anyone to be able to sneak up on me like that, especially as freaked out as I'd been a few minutes ago, trying to find the source of the initial stick snapping. I jumped right up, tool in hand, and looked in the direction of the snap. That's when I saw it. About 20 feet away from where I stood, a silhouette, easily distinguishable from the trees, as there were no branches on this particular silhouette. Not to mention, it wasn't there when I looked previously. What I did see, though, was a definite head sitting on top of a neck across the top of some very broad shoulders and was standing about 7.5 feet tall. But it also had eyes, big eyes, that were glinting a bit from the moonlight. Needless to say, I turned and hightailed it back to the road, sprinting like a madman until I found some other people from my crew. I talked to the people who were around me, and none of them saw or heard anything the rest of that night or any other night that we were on top of that ridge, but I know what I saw, and whatever it was definitely wasn't human, and it absolutely terrified me. Thanks for reading. Signed, Brian. And there it is. All the true cryptid encounter stories I have for you tonight. So what'd you think about these? I can't wait to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments below, but please, keep it respectful to the witnesses. And if you have a strange experience or an unexplained encounter that you want to share, just send it to the email address in the description and, well, your story may just wind up in a future video. Anyways, thanks so much for riding with me tonight. I really appreciate you. And until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I'll be seeing you on down the road a ways. Biker out.